Hello and welcome to Exploratory Scenario Planning for Large Landscape Conservation. I have my presentation up and running here, and my name is Erika Mahoney Yen, and I will be guiding us through today's webinar. The Practitioners Network is pleased to team up with the Sonoran Institute to offer this session today. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Practitioners Network for Large Landscape Conservation, the network is a group of people and organizations who have come together to advance the understanding of large landscape conservation, including what it is, where it's occurring, where it's achieving, and to connect people engaged in this field to share best practices and lessons learned, explore policy options that support large landscape conservation, and to build the constituency for large landscape conservation research. The network often looks to partners like the Sonoran Institute to share their experience and expertise with others in the network for everyone's mutual benefit. So if you or your organization is interested in helping organize or sponsor a webinar like this, please drop us a line and let us know. We'd love to have you. All right, so the webinar today will be recorded and posted on the network's new website located at largelandscapenetwork.org. And we also encourage you to visit the site, join the LinkedIn network, add your large landscape initiative to the initiative map if you haven't already, and just let us know what you think about this new resource. The website is meant to be a resource for everyone, and we welcome your feedback on what you'd like to see. So you can contact either Sean Johnson or myself with your thoughts and feedback. And then finally, we invite you to mark your calendars for the National Workshop on Large Landscape Conservation, which is set for October 23rd and 24th in Washington, D.C. And details about this workshop are still being worked through, so just head over to the website and you can get more information about it in the coming weeks. So with all that being said, let's continue on with our session. Joining us today, we have Joe Marlow, who's a land economist with the Sonoran Institute, and he will be introducing the concepts of scenario planning, including a brief overview and methods for conducting the scenario planning process. Afterwards, we'll have the presentation of two case studies, and these are two very different case studies that cover different uses of scenario planning. We have Stephen Aldrich, president of BioEra, and he will be discussing his experience using scenario planning to strengthen the preparedness and adaptive capacity of the Hudson River Estuary Watershed to meet the future impacts of climate change. And then after Stephen, we'll have Kent Redford, principal at Archipelago Consulting, who will discuss the Futures of the Wild. It's a project of the Wildlife Conservation Society Futures Group. And there are two documents that accompany these case studies, and they are both available on the website. If you just go to largelandscapenetwork.org and click on webinars, you will find both of those documents. So today, if you have any questions for our presenters, you can go ahead and submit them through the questions panel. And so we'll be doing questions after each of the presentations and at the end. So with that, I will hand the presentation over to our first presenter. We have Joe Marlow. All right, Joe, I'll go ahead and send this over to you.
Thanks, Erika.
Thanks, Joe.
All right, I think I have that up there.
Yep, looks good.
Right, good morning and good afternoon. Thanks for coming to this webinar. I'm going to be introducing the exploratory scenario planning concept and talk about under what conditions this technique is useful, review some general outputs and outcomes that could result from such a process, and present a general exploratory scenario planning methodology, and point you to some additional resources. And speaking of resources, I want to draw your attention to the fact that most of this content is developed by Stephen Aldrich. He's one of my resources, and you can find about him in the link that I have at the end. So to get going here, exploratory scenario planning is really about developing strategies and policies and plans and actions that are resilient, that will allow you, your organization, or your community to deal with change and uncertainty and adversity, essentially be able to bounce back from those things. It's a creative approach to decision making, and its main utility is in long-term planning. In exploratory scenario planning, it essentially facilitates social learning, and it uses narratives or stories about what might occur in the future and how one could get from now to a future. Scenario planning is not about modeling the future or predicting the future, and it won't provide you an accurate picture of what the future will look like. And from my perspective, it's not really a science, it's more of an art. Although, of course, science can support particular efforts, and same thing with modeling. It can support the scenario planning, but the actual scenario planning process itself really is more, seems to me, as of an art form. And the focus of today's webinar is exploratory scenario planning. And this is concerned with developing plans, strategies, policies, and or actions that will be robust across a range of plausible futures, or that are adaptive as conditions change. And I want to emphasize that it's exploratory scenario planning is very different from what is sometimes called normative scenario planning, which you may have seen in the past. Normative approaches are concerned with developing strategies for a preferred outcome or a desired future. And those types of processes can be recognized by the scenarios. They're often something like a high, medium, or a low, or a business as usual, and something better or something worse, good, bad, and ugly, and everyone pretty much knows the scenario that's preferred or desired. That's really different than exploratory approaches. Exploratory approaches focus on the question of what if, and it's concerned with external factors or forces, things that are generally out of your control, out of our control. Another way to think about it, and this is a phrase from Ray Quay, another one of my resources, it's really, exploratory scenario planning is really about anticipating and adapting instead of predicting and planning. One thing about predictions is that they will be wrong. That's one of those truisms, and the question is just how wrong they'll be. So if you have a plan based upon something that's wrong, you could be in some problems. Anticipate and adapt instead of predict and plan. So thinking about conditions under which scenario planning is useful, it's useful when one or all of these here on the screen are operating, and it's most useful under conditions of high uncertainty and high complexity. And so to talk about uncertainty, high uncertainty, there's some different forms of uncertainty. One is cumulative. Uncertainty increases as you move away from the current conditions. A dynamic component, in which many uncertain factors are interacting to create that uncertainty. And there's also political uncertainty, in which systems that you're working with are involving humans in decision making. And in thinking about complexity, there's a few different forms of complexity to think about. One is scaling complexity. When you have, there's a couple of different ones of those. I think one of them is where you have cause and effect operating at different temporal and spatial scales. So if you think about carbon dioxide forcing in the atmosphere, you can dump a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in a very short time frame, but then you live with those effects for centuries. So you have different scales going on there. Another scaling complexity is a system and a management approach or a management structure that where there's a mismatch in scales. In large landscape, management might fit under that or does fit under that. You think about the Colorado River, maybe. It's in many states, 2 countries, but a lot of the management is piece by piece, so there's a mismatch there between the scale of the ecosystem or the entity and how it's managed. So when highly uncertain and high uncertainty and high complexity are operating together is when scenario planning is very useful. And these exploratory scenario planning approaches are not applicable under all situations. If you've got low uncertainty, you can use different approaches. Probabilistic models, deterministic models, observations, polling can give you some information. If you have low complexity, you don't need to use exploratory approaches either. You can look at existing solutions or appeal to experts. There's some other approaches there. But when you've got this VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous situation, exploratory scenario planning can be very, very useful, very helpful. There's a significant commitment of time and resources that are required to do scenario planning. To be done well, it requires time, resources, and commitment to the process. If you're in a hurry or if you have limited resources, you should probably consider some other approach. And Steve and Kent can speak more to these time frames, but from what I've seen, 6 to 9 months for a small-scale project that's fairly constrained wouldn't be unreasonable. And if you have a large multi-stakeholder process, it might be 1 or 2 years that it will take, and similar levels of resources, and the people that are involved in it really need to be committed to stick through the process, to go all the way through to the end. Of course, you get much better results that way. So to think about some of the outputs and outcomes from exploratory scenario planning, you can yield a whole array of these. It's really a social learning process, so some of those outcomes under that category might be shared learning, shared understanding, a common vocabulary is developed among the participants, stakeholders, actors, participants can achieve alignment on the issue. It's definitely very good for people to gain an understanding of other perspectives. And a result of these social learning components, exploratory scenario planning can be very effective for public involvement in engaging stakeholders when seeking solutions. Another outcome is improvement in adaptive capacity of an organization or a community or group that's doing the planning. Some outputs are the narratives themselves, the stories about the plausible futures, strategic plans, adaptive policies and strategies. And to my way of thinking, the real value that results from exploratory approaches is really a change in thinking of the people that are participating, or a change in thinking of the organization or group that's working through this. All those outputs and other outputs and outcomes are valuable, but that sort of change in your perspective can be very valuable. Looking at things under that anticipate and adapt paradigm instead of the predict and plan. So to get into this general methodology, there are many methods. This is only one of those. It's fairly straightforward to apply. It's not really easy. That's why I got the quotes there. It can be a very hard process, actually, when you get into it. But there's three main phases. Essentially, ground the process, build a shared understanding of the situation, and then decide what to do. And I'm going to spend some time going through these stages in a little bit more detail. So to break that first foundational component up, you start out with developing some information on the focal issue. Identify what that focal issue, what is the primary problem or system that you're dealing with. And Steve calls this the problematique. Identify what that is. It's important to be able to articulate that very well, write it down. You also need to think about what the time horizon you're planning over. As I said, it's long-term generally where the utility is for this approach. So you need to essentially identify what your time horizon is and think about what your geography of focus is. What areas is this for? The second part in this foundational component is to essentially specify your purpose, your goals, your objectives. What are we doing here? What are we trying to achieve? What are our expected outcomes? What are the results we can get out of this? What are our deliverables? And the timeline involved. And then in the third component here on the grounding of the process is essentially to determine what that process is and what the governance is. So who will be involved? How will they be organized? What will be the process? What's the timeline? What's the milestones? Who will facilitate? Who will convene? Who will manage? How will the decisions be made? The governance. What are the rules of the game, so to speak, the rules of engagement, and how will we conduct ourselves in this process? There's a lot in there, as many of you have set up processes before, and you know that. And this first part, this grounding of the process, this building of the foundation is very critical. They're preliminaries, but they're very critical in order for your process to work and to get some good results out of it. Moving on to the second phase, developing a shared understanding and thinking about that first one. You really want to understand the existing situation. And this is the part here has to do with identifying what are sometimes called the scenario elements. There's four of those, four main types. Things that are predetermined, essentially statements about the future that are predetermined to be true. I'll steal another example from Steve. If you're in a plane and you're flying in the air and you jump out of the plane, it's predetermined that you're going to hit the ground. So what statements, are predetermined to be true? What are the driving forces? That's another scenario element. What is driving the change in the system? The long forces that are driving the change in the system. Another scenario element is the prime movers. Who are the people? What are the institutions? What are the organizations that will shape the future? And then finally, the major uncertainties, the unknowns that could determine which future occurs. And these are critical. These uncertainties are really what you use to develop a framework and develop the scenarios. And once you go through this process of trying to figure out what these elements are and understanding the existing situation, you'll always have information that you don't know or data that you don't have. And so it's critical to develop a learning agenda. What else do we need to know? What else do we need to find out? And this can sort of be an iterative process here in this first part of understanding is the existing situation. Figure out what you don't know, go get some information, come back through it. What else don't we know? You might have to go through that a couple times really to get the information and data that you need to go forward. And in that vein of thinking about determinants of change, take a little side journey here. The Sonoran Institute last year was looking at thinking about conservation in the western U.S. And that was essentially our focal issue. You know, what does the future look like? How do we remain relevant as an organization? And we also were wanting to put together a library of these scenario elements. So we conducted a whole series of interviews. I think there were about 40 of them. We talked through with people, you know, what are those key determinants of change in the future. And then we pulled that information together and invited, I think, a dozen or 15 experts in these various fields, people from business, from academia, from government, from the NGO world, together to essentially brainstorm and talk through these. And we came up with a long list, a big vector of change factors, and we developed a document based on that. It's available. I believe that's on the resources that I have listed at the end. But you know, some of the top ones that came up were, you know, economy, demographics, technology, and of course these are just the big categories. We had about, I think, 10 categories, and there were a whole series of separate, you know, elements under each of these. A big list. Not intended to serve as one of the reasons we developed this as a library was to have it available for people to look at if you're going into one of these processes, not to become your list of scenario elements, but just to show you, you know, what some other people are thinking and to sort of inform that thinking process about it. I learned a lot in this workshop and in the interviews. It was pretty fun work. So back into the process. The second part here, once understanding of the existing situations has been developed, is to develop a scenario framework. And that's done using some major uncertainties. And there's a whole series of approaches here that are used. One fairly simple one is to have a couple of uncertainties, put those on a couple of axes, and that can be your framework. That gives you 4 different scenarios. The idea is to have some scenarios that are very different and plausible. There are, of course, many other techniques to come up with this framework, different frameworks to use. This one is one that we've worked with, and it seems pretty useful. Here's just an example, you know, thinking of, you know, cities maybe doing some economic development, some planning for economic development, some scenario planning. Here's a couple key uncertainties. Will the city attract additional key employers, and will they have a sustainable water supply? So I can give you, in these 4 quadrants, you know, sort of the framework for writing your scenarios. And you can imagine, you know, you've attracted the key employers and you have a sustainable water supply, or you've attracted them and you don't have a sustainable water supply. Very different but plausible futures. And then using that framework in those, in this case, those quadrants or other approaches to scenario, to developing the basis for the scenario, is to create the scenarios, essentially to write up these stories, these narratives that explain how you get from what the current situation is to that plausible future. And these scenarios can be very powerful, very useful. In some of the exercises that we've done, both internally and here at Sonoran Institute, and then externally, even the title of the scenario, if it's well crafted, well chosen, can be a shorthand and carry just a lot of information. And some scenario planning processes, when they get to the scenarios, they use those as a main tool and go forward just with that. They may not even get to the planning part. Just getting to these narratives about what some plausible futures are can be very useful. And as I've mentioned, a couple of processes we've gone through, we just got to that stage, and those narratives were quite useful to the people that were involved in their planning work that they did afterwards. So these narratives can be very, very powerful, very useful, especially if care is taken in developing those. So the final stage out of the 3 stages is really decide what to do. And there's a lot in here, and can be quite a bit of complexity here. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but basically the steps in this final stage, the planning part of scenario planning, is to identify some potential response options or strategies or actions. Basically brainstorm these. And Steve may talk about the huge list they developed in the rising waters, quite a few. You just come up with some actions and some possible responses, and then develop some criteria to evaluate those. Some typical ones might be, these need to be important, objective, and measurable. Some of those might be cost, or political feasibility, or return on investment, or environmental impact, or the likelihood of it working as expected. Whatever the criteria that makes sense for a particular problem, identify those. Those are evaluation criteria just for the criteria. Then essentially evaluate those response options and compile those results. This particular action will work, but it's going to be very expensive. Or this one is politically infeasible, however it's inexpensive. Essentially develop these criteria and evaluate the response options and compile those results. Then the different response options are essentially performance tested against the scenarios, against the plausible futures. Will this work in this particular future? So for instance, if you have, maybe going back to that example of, if you're thinking about, I don't know, water supply or something in your town, and you have one of your futures is that the economy is doing very well and your water supply is very low. Maybe your strategy is conserve water. Does it work in that particular one? Does it work in the particular scenario where your economy's going south? Basically do that performance testing. And then using your evaluation criteria and your performance testing, select some options to implement and essentially prioritize those. Figure out what you're going to do in what action. As I said, there's a whole lot in these stages here. It's difficult to cover in a brief presentation like this, but this is one of the key steps. This is the planning part, essentially, of scenario planning. That essentially is the end of my presentation here. I just want to remind you that exploratory approaches are really about resilience, developing plans, strategies, options, actions that will work in the face of change, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. And here are some resources for you at this hidden link on our website. It's a weird color match there, but it's essentially sonoraninstitute.org/XSP. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take any emails or conversations with you in the future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Well, that was a great foundation to start us off with this presentation. We don't have any questions at this time, but I think as we move into the detailed project presentations, we'll probably have some questions come up. Thank you so much. So I am going to make Stephen our next presenter here. And Stephen, if you'd like to come online, unmute yourself, and I see your presentation there. Sure, thanks, Stephen.
Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Aldrich, the founder and president of a research and consulting firm called Bioeconomic Research Associates, or BioEra. And in 2007, we were retained by the Nature Conservancy to plan and structure a large multi-stakeholder project in the Hudson Valley to identify strategies that would improve the adaptive capacity of the Hudson River Valley watershed to the expected impacts of climate change. We began doing this in 2008, and BioEra, my organization, was the principal facilitators of this process, and we also ended up as the principal authors of the final project report. The project itself was sponsored primarily by the Eastern New York chapter of the Nature Conservancy and secondarily by the Carey Institute for Ecosystem Studies, the Hudson River Estuary Program, and the National Estuarine Research Reserve, along with a nonprofit called Sustainable Hudson Valley. The Hudson Valley is a big landscape. It covers about 20 counties in New York. It's you know, an area just roughly comparable to the size of Massachusetts, so it's a pretty big space, and that presented, as you would imagine, a considerable challenge to execute a planning effort across such a wide area with such a diverse group of stakeholders. The stakeholders included people from major private sector players such as the railroads or major employers in the region like IBM, as well as state government, local government, representatives from various agencies, and a variety of nonprofits. So again, it was about 140 organizations that participated. The problem at the time was that scientists were predicting that in future years the watershed would likely experience earlier spring thaws and later autumn frosts, higher incidence of extreme weather events, including severe storms, floods, heat waves, and droughts. In general, a lot more precipitation and more of it falling as rain. There were also predictions that changes in the climate would increase the likelihood of invasion from non-native species and the likelihood of novel disease outbreaks. And it was already observed that saltwater incursion coming up from the sea was making it further and further up the river as far north as Albany. Now, those were predictions about what would happen at the regional scale, but right along with those predictions, there was a great deal of uncertainty that would affect exactly how things were expected to unfold. Those uncertainties included things like the rate of greenhouse gas buildup, the probability that we might have catastrophic change, so there was people would acknowledge that there was a possibility that catastrophic change might suddenly occur, but no one was sure about what the probabilities were for that. There was very little information on the second, third, and fourth order feedback effects. There was very little information available on local impacts at, say, the town level. And there was very little information, virtually none, on the effectiveness of alternative mitigation and adaptation strategies. So there was a lot of uncertainty wrapped around the predictions that that scientists were making about how the climate might change. So as Joe discussed in his opening remarks, that kind of situation where you have both a high degree of uncertainty and a high degree of complexity, which was certainly the case in considering the Hudson River watershed, is an appropriate place to deploy the scenario planning methodologies, and so we decided to do that. And as Joe said, it's not always the case, but that it is appropriate to use scenario planning tools, but in this case we thought it was appropriate. And as Joe reviewed, this generally is divided into three big phases. The grounding phase, as Joe reviewed, is foundational and very, very critical. And it's extremely important to be sure that you build what some people call a strong container for especially a multi-stakeholder process, remembering that in many cases you're bringing together interests that are highly divergent. and there's great opportunity for conflict. There's also great opportunity for individual interests to assert themselves down the line. Many times I have engaged in these processes and everyone agrees easily at the front end of the process to the ground rules and to the idea that it's a shared and equal governance process, so we have more or less a democratic process in which a steering committee will be one man, one vote, or one person, one vote. But as we move closer to the end of the process, if the collective results are not reflective of individual interests, well, obviously that sets up an opportunity for conflict. So it is extremely important, just to emphasize that all of the elements of grounding the process, the financial support the process will need, the identification and recruitment of the stakeholders that the process will need, the articulation of governance, that all of those things be done thoroughly and correctly so that you have that strong container for going forward. As Joe said, once you have that, the second phase of the process is really about this building a shared understanding. And as Joe mentioned, scenario planning methods are social learning methods. They were originally evolved as a way of combating the dangers of groupthink, where everyone believes one particular thing or they have one particular idea of the way the future will unfold, and as a result, organizations or groups of people become brittle and not capable of being flexible and adaptable as circumstances change. So much of the effort of the scenario development process is focused on making sure that we're all on the same page. And that process of getting on the same page can be contentious and it can be draining. It can be there can be a lot of conflict involved, but it is very much at the end of the day what the process is about, and the benefits flow from that. As I'm fond of quoting George Bernard Shaw on the question. He famously said, the problem with communication is the illusion that it's occurred. And I would say that there's a great deal of effort in scenario planning methodologies to combat that problem. And sometimes participants get frustrated with how slow it is, but it's worth it at the end. And as Joe mentioned, once you've built that shared understanding and developed your scenarios and chosen a set of scenarios to work with and a scenarios framework, you then can turn your attention to what traditional planners do, which is setting up a process to evaluate different possibilities for what we should do. And I'm going to review for you the process that we went through in the Rising Waters project, so you get a sense of concretely how the abstract concepts that Joe presented could be executed in a real life situation. Okay, this is just another way of saying the same thing that both Joe and I have already said. That it's just the process that you go through. It's actually very progressive and very logical. In this way of depicting it, you're climbing a staircase, starting with building a shared understanding, and then you deconstruct the present situation using the categories that Joe mentioned of predetermined elements, driving forces and major uncertainties and prime movers. And then once you have those and you've whittled down your elements to a reasonable number, you use those elements to develop a scenarios framework and then the scenarios themselves. Once you've got a set of scenarios that are in accordance with your framework, you can then evaluate the response options after you've identified possibilities across those different futures. And ultimately choose a set of strategies or response options that you think make sense, in large measure because they're robust. And when we talk about robustness in scenario planning, as Joe mentioned, what we mean is that the strategy seems to work not only in one scenario, but it works in all scenarios or in the majority of the scenarios. I mentioned that BioEra was hired to structure the project plan for Rising Waters, and I'll spend a moment just to give you an idea of what that looks like. In our view, what we try to do is set up a situation where there's a tier of activities that's taking place with all of the participants. Those are the stakeholders. And we generally organize those into a series of workshops. Often you can do it with just 3 workshops, the collective workshops. But I think in the case of Rising Waters, we may have, I know we required more than 3. I can't remember whether it was 4 or 5. But that was over the course of 18 months or so. So those events are large. In the case of Rising Waters, I think the most people we had at any one event was probably something like 100 or 125. There's another layer of organization to the process, which is from the group of stakeholders, the larger group of stakeholders, we recruited a representative team to take responsibility for actually crafting the scenarios. That's the scenarios team. And supporting the scenarios team were a number of ad hoc working groups. These, as Joe mentioned, you discover very early on in the process of building scenarios that there's a lot that you need to learn. And much of that, the actual work of doing that learning, can be organized into smaller working groups, which in effect are outputting information and what they learn back to the scenarios team. The scenarios team is using the information that they get back to develop the scenarios framework and the draft scenarios. And those draft scenarios are then shared with all of the stakeholders at the larger stakeholder meetings, and the input and criticism or suggestions from the stakeholders flow back to the scenarios team, and there may be some iteration between the working groups and the scenarios team, but that's the basic dynamic of going from the larger group to the scenarios team and to the working groups and then back again. Overseeing all of this activity is a steering committee. And again, the steering committees are often made up of principal funders as well as some representative participants. Joe mentioned products and deliverables and endpoints, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but just touch. In the case of Rising Waters, the goal was to identify a set of recommendations that could be implemented going forward. We decided that there was also a strong pedagogical value in explaining our process and explaining the background science behind the situation we were facing. And so we did create a quite detailed and informative report that included an explication of the entire process we were going through, and contained a great deal of information about the expected changes and what the situation would be like in the Hudson Valley from the point of view of climate change in 2030. We were using a 20-year horizon for that project, and it also included the recommendations and how we arrived at those recommendations. One of the things that's extremely important to do in a multi-stakeholder process, and I highly urge everyone to this, is that it's extremely important to be as transparent as you possibly can be and document all of the steps you're taking in your decision-making process and how you arrived at things. If you do that, and if you're doing that with the consent, and in many cases it'll be the consensus of the participants, it simply strengthens the degree of alignment and buy-in you get from not only the participants themselves, but also others who come late to the process, and it very much improves the pedagogical value and the long-run utility of what you're doing. Just to mention, as I already have, this was the structure and governance that we used in the process. The stakeholder participants were all of the different interests that we gathered together. From those participants, we developed a representative scenarios team. Usually the scenarios team is about a dozen people. You know, it should never be more, I don't think, than 18 or so. And certainly it can be as thin as 6. So you just have to kind of feel it. But it is important that it not be too big so that it becomes unwieldy. And the working groups were ad hoc. As I said, we formed them as we needed them, and they did their work. There could be, generally they were a handful of people per working group, but you could certainly have more. Steering committee was made up of about a half a dozen people. Again, the principal funders were represented on that committee. And we did use, and I would recommend that a fairly robust online collaborative work program of some kind be used. We used a program called Power Steering Software. These are the 4 scenarios that we developed. As Joe mentioned, the names of the scenarios may give you some idea of what the scenarios were about. The 2 uncertainties that framed up the scenarios framework for us were subtle in a way and interesting. The first, the x-axis, people felt in our effort that it was that since we were asking the question in our scenarios of what would the future adaptive capacity of the Hudson Valley be to withstand the impacts of climate change, people thought it was important to, very important to thinking about that, to keep in mind that a lot would depend on how little or how much got done to strengthen the adaptive capacity of the valley over the 20-year period. So we chose that as one of the 2 uncertainties that would determine our scenarios framework, with the other being an interesting one that I wasn't expecting when I went into it, which is how much of what got done would be done in concert with natural systems or in opposition, for lack of a better word, to natural systems. And to illustrate that, I would say, well, there are different strategies, for example, relative to controlling flooding along a river. You could harden river banks, which is, and channelize rivers. But that would be an example of something that is less in concert with natural systems. And on the other hand, you could ensure that there was a floodplain or a wetland area connected to a floodplain that was capable of absorbing overflow from the river during periods of flood. That would be an example of working more in concert with natural systems. So those were the 2 uncertainties around which we structured these 4 scenarios. It's not really important to go into the details of these scenarios, but we had a great many proposed scenarios written in the creative part of the process. Everyone participated in trying to put together ideas for the scenarios, and And then the scenarios team carefully took in all of that creative energy and all of the ideas and was able to distill the wisdom of the larger group down into these 4 quite tight and quite interesting, very different scenario outcomes that respected the logic that we had come up with using the uncertainties. Once we had done that, once we had settled on our 4 scenarios, we then really turned almost at a 90-degree angle from the creative and expansive process of thinking about the future and became planners. And the first thing we did was to forget about our scenarios list entirely and simply focus on identifying potential response strategies and options given the geography, the time horizon, and the threat that we were trying to deal with, namely the threat of climate change. And you know, we did this typical things you do. We researched what others had done, looked for good ideas or best practices, and we also considered actions taken for analogous situations. So a good one would be infectious disease outbreaks versus new invasive species. I mean, people don't, if you're combating invasive species, you're a conservation biologist, you may not think that some of the best strategies you might look for would come out of the public health sector where people are combating emerging infectious disease. But when you think about it, you realize that those situations are actually quite analogous. And so we did make a conscious effort to look for those analogous situations and to examine best practices in them to see if we could get any good ideas. We also did a great job of brainstorming ideas for action among the participants. Again, one of the great virtues of running a multi-stakeholder process is that you have an enormous amount of expertise when you run a process like Rising Waters in the room, and tremendous variation in experience and great diversity in experience. And so people can contribute a lot. In our case, in Rising Waters, this process of generating ideas ended up initially generating a list of over 400 proposed strategies and options, and you know, that was too much for us to deal with. And so we did look for ways to consolidate that list and to consolidate similar ideas into a final list of candidates for evaluation, which was between 80 and 100 ideas. And then, as Joe mentioned, we developed a set of objective criteria to evaluate these options, because the list itself is a smorgasbord of all kinds of ideas, and what you really want to do is try to create this simple, transparent way of evaluating these different ideas the same way. And so we went through a process of searching for evaluation criteria that we could use, and the only criteria, what was important in doing so was that we wanted to latch on to criteria that we felt were very important, that we felt were objective, and that we felt were measurable. And in the end, we selected, through consensus and vote, 8 criteria to use. And for each criteria, we developed a simple, transparent scale that anybody would be able to look at and then apply that scale to their own evaluation of any given option for that criteria. So I'll give you an example. These are the actual criteria that we chose for the Rising Waters project. We asked ourselves questions like, what would we thought it was important to evaluate the likelihood of performing to expectations when implemented for every single idea. You know, how likely is this to actually perform to expectations? We thought barriers to implementation and adoption were important. We thought that, you know, would it last? Would the solution last? So durability was important. What would the environmental effect be? The equity refers to social equity. Was this an idea that had social equity, or where did it fall on the scale? Again, a transparent scale, etc. This is what I mean by a simple transparent scale. This is actually the scale that we used, and you see at the bottom of this chart the anticipated economic cost through 2030 and the avoided cost through 2030, and these are just to the nearest order of magnitude. That scale starts at the very bottom at under $100,000. So, you know, if an idea, if the avoided cost would just be under $100,000, well, that would have been low on the scale. A really great outcome is if we could avoid $100 million worth of cost, or more than $100 million worth of cost through 2030. Well, that's a great outcome. So that gets a 5, and level 1 at less than 100,000 gets a 1. And again, that's what we're trying to do. It's not science. It's not rocket science. It's just trying to apply basic knowledge and common sense in a consistent way. Once we had evaluated, this is a spreadsheet that actually shows you the option number on the far left, so there's no particular order here, I don't think, and the name of the option, and then our criteria, and each one of these has been ranked by, and we had all the participants rank all of the options. We also went outside of the participants and sought out experts to also help us in this process. And we grouped all of that. There wasn't very much difference between the expert, very little difference, in fact, between the expert judgment and the judgment of the participants. So the wisdom of crowds definitely held true in this particular case. And then we were able to develop an overall ranking for each option based on the results we got. And by the way, we used simple questionnaires that we developed for each option that mirrored in filling the questionnaire out, people were providing us with the data that where they didn't necessarily realize it, but we were using the scaling to ask the questions, so their answers fit very nicely into our transparent scales. One of the benefits of doing things this way is that you can, this is just, oh, I never fixed this slide. No, I apologize. You can plot these spider diagrams, which for any option, if you arrange your scales correctly, then you can have a situation for any option where the area of the space inside the blue diagram there that's built around the center of the diagram on the left reflects the quality of the overall response. So in this case, the green diagram there shape is out of place. It should be around the center of the bullseye there. And if it were, what you would notice is that option 2 was nowhere near as attractive as option 1, because the area of that internal to that green shape was much smaller than the area internal to the blue shape in option 1. So that's just the only point being that it's a simple visual way to compare the attractiveness different options across as many as 8 criteria that are all being judged on a scale of 1 to 5. Once we finished with the independent evaluation of our options according to our criteria, and we had them ranked that way, we then evaluated every option across, as Joe mentioned, across each of our 4 scenarios. And once again, we developed a transparent scale so that anyone would be able to do this. And we, in this case, we did it on a scale of -3 to +3, so there were 6 possibilities. And this is just to show you a kind of a cartoon of the sort of result that you get, where you get some options that perform very well in 1 or 2 scenarios, but not very well at all or quite poorly in the other 2 scenarios. And what we were looking for is a cumulative score, a cumulative plus score, so that in this particular diagram, the best, most attractive option for our purposes would be the top 2, option 1 and option 2. Those outperform option 3 and option 4 from our perspective. And this is just another, this is actually the options themselves and the judgments that were made about those options. It's the same thing, but it's taking the actual options that we used in the process and showing you that what we did. And then finally, the final step in all of this is not mechanical. So what we did quite concretely was to combine the independent criteria-based analysis and evaluation of the options with the scenario-based analysis so that we got a cumulative score, and we ranked all those and we saw which ones fell out at the top of that were the most attractive. But we then used our brains to decide, based on that, which of these options we actually thought we should recommend. So it wasn't completely mechanical. The mechanical part of the evaluation process was input to the group debating and discussing the top options and then ultimately putting forward a set of recommendations. What was very, very interesting to note, and what I think is one of the most important things about this kind of process, is that if you do this, if you were to follow the methodology in a big group, you would discover that people who had diametrically opposed interests, in many cases, at the end of the day, there would be a set of recommended actions or outcomes that everyone or almost everyone agreed should be implemented. So there's a kind of rise to the top in this process of no losers, or a set of no loser options. And that is a result of everyone participating as the process goes along in the logic and the identification of what's important to the system and what should be considered in the criteria and everything. All of that, having the group, all the group learning that's taken place and the shared understanding that you've built, in the end is reflected in a set of no loser options that rise to the top that pretty much everybody can agree on. And that, for me, is one of the main takeaways of a process like this. And with that, I think I'll stop. And if anyone wants to reach me with additional questions about any of this, my email address is saldrich, A-L-D-R-I-C-H, that's all one word, S-A-L-D-R-I-C-H, at bio-era.net. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Stephen. So before you go, we have a few questions here, and Joe, you might be able to help with this as well. We had a question at the end of Joe's presentation about how does scenario planning relate to economic development or development policy. So we kind of looked at it in terms of climate, but what about economic development?
Well,
go ahead.
Do you want to go ahead with that, Joe?
I can take a shot at it.
Mm-hmm.
I had a conversation about this just yesterday, and it seems to me that because of all of the uncertainty and changes, just look at what happened in the macroeconomy over the last 6 or 8 years. There's a lot of turmoil and churning and a lot of uncertainty. I think exploratory approaches, scenario planning approaches, have great utility in there, in that field. I think a lot of, and this is not to ding economic development authorities or planners, but I think a lot of economic development thinking is essentially chasing after something that has worked somewhere else and sort of a rear view mirror, what worked or what's working somewhere else at the same time. Maybe it's a side view mirror. But I think the way that the future plays out is unknown and unknowable, and I think considering a wider set of potential futures can be very useful.
Yeah, I would only add to that the economy writ large is a very complex and highly uncertain system with a lot of actors, and as such, it is both unpredictable and a very good candidate for these techniques. So certainly in my career, I mean, the majority of the scenario work I've done has involved fundamental uncertainties about the future of the economy, whether it be oil prices or energy prices or economic growth or any one of a number of things. It's appropriate.
Great. And Stephen, I have a process question for you. It's about how the workshops were conducted when you engage such a large group, and if you had to split up the participants into smaller groups, and maybe walk us through that.
Yeah, we typically these workshops were divided really into two kinds of activities. There was a information downloading activity in which someone like me would get up and walk people through the process that we were engaging in, or the particular phase of the process that we were engaging in, and giving them both what we were going to do and an explanation of why we were going to do it this way, and the theory behind what we were going to do. And then we would typically divide into groups and do whatever the activity was. So a good example would be when you are deconstructing using the scenario categories to deconstruct the present, you might form 4 groups. You might form a group, or break the main group into 4 groups. A group that would focus on predetermined elements, a group that would focus on driving forces, another one that major uncertainties, and the final one on prime movers. And you'd send them off to spend the day with a mission of, or the afternoon, with the mission of coming up with a list of no more than a dozen, let's say, of what they thought were the most important elements inside that category. So what were the most important 12 predetermined elements affecting the system you were considering, or the most important dozen driving forces? And then they would come back, all the groups would come back together, and there'd be a reporting out, and there'd be collectively a sharing of that information, but also a debating of it. And one of the most important things in a big multi-stakeholder scenario planning exercise is the debating, the disagreement and debate that takes place over over what people may have nominated to be in what category. A lot of that, and this comes up all the time, as Joe will attest and Kent can attest, is a struggle over whether or not something is predetermined or is it a major uncertainty. Is it a driving force or is it a major uncertainty? And in the process of debating this, in the process of struggling to hash out what's what, two things happen. One thing, and there's no right answer necessarily, but two things definitely happen. One, you're drawing out of the group the collective knowledge that the group has. So people are learning a tremendous amount just by participating and listening to that debate. But the second thing that happens is that while that's happening, if you have a good scenario facilitator, or a good process facilitator, what they're going to be doing is they're going to be making note on a big whiteboard somewhere in the room that's labeled learning agenda. And they're going to be identifying, you know what, we don't know the answer to this question. We better learn about it. We're going to have to learn more about this or more about that. And the more that that happens and the more that the process is structured to truly follow up on that and feed what's discovered back to the stakeholders, the more it gains legitimacy and people begin to trust it. Trust is an enormous component of what makes these processes go. There are many, many times when I've been in these processes where there were powerful and important people in the room who knew better than, they dismiss the process because they know better. And part of that's why, or it's a big part of the reason why it's so important to both invest what you have to invest to structure the container for the process, to do all that preliminary work as well as you possibly can so that you have a strong container. But it's also critical that at every step you're following a transparent process and you're documenting what you do, so that if people object, if people want to raise objections, they can do so inside the context of the process. That's welcome, and we'll struggle through those. But it makes it extremely difficult if you do what I'm suggesting, for people to dismiss the overall process because they can't point to any particular place where the process lost legitimacy. They may decide as people with interest. It is common, as I mentioned, in running multi-stakeholder processes to have as you approach the end of the process, to have particular interests decide that it would be better if this process either failed or, if they could stop the direction it was going in, that would be better than where it's going. And so you do have to have a strong container to withstand that.
Great. Thanks, Steve. We have a few more questions here, but I would like to move on to Kent's presentation, and then we'll answer remaining questions at the end. All right. So thank you so much, Stephen. All right. Kent, I have your slide up, so you can start whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all of your interest in this topic, and I recognize for those of you on Mountain Time that we're eating into lunch. So I'll try and be brief. I have just a few minutes, and I want to talk about a very different context for use of the scenario planning. But I want to start out by making three observations that are not new to any of us, but I think are important when considering thinking about the future. First is that humans are fascinated with the future, and we really want to figure out what's going to happen in the future. The second is that we seem to be biologically, evolutionarily very bad at thinking about the future. There have been some work that has been done by people like Daniel Gilbert, who's in the psychology department at Harvard, or Canahan, who's written a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, Nobel Economics winner at Princeton. And they really show that people are very bad at determining the future or even thinking about the future. And that what we tend to do is sample from the past and then roll it forward and paste it into what we think is the future. The third observation is that we don't know the future when it arrives on our doorstep. So recognizing that, in fact, the future has arrived is also something we don't seem to be very good at. All of these things are dealt with in the process of a group exercise having to do with scenario planning. And I start out with that. It's a fairly simple statement, but it's super important because it turns out if you just polled individuals about the future and what would happen about a large landscape, about an institution, about anything, that you'd have marked disagreements, and probably, were you to know what the future would bring, none of them would be right, or the number that would be right would be very small. So you really are bringing people together in a process, and this has been emphasized by Joe and by Steve, that the process is a super important part of this. And the process as achieving buy-in for the exercise is what you're really after in many ways. So we, so let me start. I am working for myself for Archipelago Consulting now, but I worked for 14 years at the Wildlife Conservation Society, which is a large conservation NGO based in New York that runs the 4 New York City zoos and aquarium and also has field programs in 60 so countries. The president of WCS at the time, Steve Sanderson, formed a small group of people in the institution called the Futures Group. And he asked us to help him think about what elements of the future would be influencing the long-term ability of the institution to achieve its mission, which is, in the shorthand of which is conserving wildlife and wild places. We were fortunate to be put in contact with Steve Aldrich, who you've just heard from, and he and his colleague Jim Newcomb helped us through a formal scenario planning exercise. But unlike the Hudson Valley one, the unit in this case was an institution. So this was a formal scenario planning process for the Wildlife Conservation Society as it thought about how to think about the future and its mission. So getting Steve Aldrich and Jim to help us was part of the process of convincing the institution, its staff, and its trustees to think about this exercise as having value. And so we explicitly said that we did not have money and needed to go to the trustees of the institution to make the case for this exercise. And if they believed in the importance of the exercise, they would then need to find new resources to be able to pay for it. And in fact, they did. Within an hour after we completed the presentation, the money had been generated by trustees to do this. And that turned out to be a very important part of this. I've emphasized the process. So having the trustees, having put their own money into this exercise, and by having been seen by the other trustees to do so, really created an enabling environment for the staff to then work. So we put together a small group of about 7 or 8 people, staff drawn from throughout the institution, from public affairs, which is government relations sort of thing, from the fundraising side, from the zoo side, from the international side. All different parts of the institution were combined in this group. And under the leadership of Steve and Jim, we then went through this exercise. And you now are familiar with it from the previous 2 presentations. I'm not going to go over that. In fact, I'm just going to tell you that we came up with 6 scenarios. And they were presented to the institution as a whole and, interestingly enough, to the larger public. So we held an open event and invited supporters and interested public, as well as WCS staff and trustees, to the institution where we presented the scenario, the logic behind the framework, and the scenarios themselves. And we did it as a piece of theater. Up on the stage, we had different people reading in different lighting formats and with different slides. And it really was quite effective in portraying the work that we had done. Now, so that was all fine up until then. We had hoped as a group and as Jim and Steve, as our facilitators and leaders, inspirers, we had hoped to get the institution to go the next step, which, as you understand, is to develop a set of signposts for each of the scenarios, and signposts being data that you would gather from the world about what was happening in the world that would allow you to determine whether you were headed into one scenario or another, or any one of the ones you've laid out. And part of formalizing this and institutionalizing the exercise is to have somebody on staff have as part of their job the gathering of data, the analyzing it, and the regular presenting to senior leadership, of whomever that is, what the data are indicating on a biannual or annual basis, what the data are indicating about which way the world is headed in terms of the scenarios. The institution, WCS, was uninterested in doing that. The feeling was that the scenario exercise, the presentation and development and presentation of the scenarios was important and useful to help steer the strategic planning of the institution, and in fact it did, but that they were not interested enough in that to actually do this signpost measurement analysis and incorporation. And so I felt as if we had gotten an A+ on the first part of the test and we'd failed the last part. When I talked to the CEO about that, he said, no, I disagree with you completely. I don't think we need the second part because we've already built into our planning the thinking behind these scenarios. Me, since I no longer work there, I can say that I don't think they did. I don't think we did, and I think that that exercise has largely been lost to the institution because it didn't create a way of keeping it fresh and reminding the senior management, which changed in many cases from when this was done. This was 7 years ago. But nonetheless, it was important at the time. It helped a lot of us think about things we hadn't done before. It's changed a lot of the way I think about the world. And I would encourage any of you who work in institutions who are interested in doing this to pursue this in the ways that have been outlined before, but to please try and make sure that you will want to do this signpost second stage in a way that was more successful than we were at WCS. And I think with that, I will stop, Erika.
All right. Actually, that kind of feeds into the question that was submitted a little while back about how to incorporating a monitoring step and revisiting and validating the scenarios over time as things change, and how to make adjustments with scenarios. So this actually may be a question for Steve or Joe, but thank you, Kent, for that different perspective on the value of scenario planning and those decision-making tools. Thank you so much.
I can speak to that. As Kent said, one of the things that, well, I think let me put it this way. I think what Kent said highlights something that is very important about entering into a scenarios process, especially when you're doing it within the context of a single organization. And it is, scenario planning is not a particularly good methodology to use for organizational planning if what's driving the planning effort inside an organization is the need simply to get a plan done. And if it's a one-off effort and we've got to get something done here, and the emphasis is we've got to be done by June 15th or whatever the date is, then scenario planning may not be the best kind of method to use, because as Kent has pointed out, or his comments make clear, scenario methods are really about incorporating a different kind of culture into an organization. So you're really trying to get an organization to adopt a way of thinking about the future that is much more flexible, much more iterative, and much more reflective than is typical in many organizations. And you really don't reap the fruits of it unless you do instill a kind of commitment by the organization to stick with this kind of changed cultural perspective for a number of years. And as Kent mentioned, the next step once you develop scenarios is often to think through the implications of the scenarios and see if you can't identify what are often called signposts or signposts that will, or early warning signs, if you like, that would tell you that you're moving from one scenario to another scenario, or what have you, you're entering a new scenario. And then you can, if you've got the commitment, you can, in many cases, easily monitor that and keep people posted. We did a big project for GSK at BioAero, GlaxoSmithKline, in which they wanted us to build a scenarios framework for emerging pandemic influenza, which we did, and we had scenario signposts that they monitored on a regular basis, and it was really quite extraordinary to see how you could apply the methodology in that context so that it was actually used and useful for decision making going forward. But it does take, be sensitive if you do feel that you're trying to bring it into your organization and you really don't have the support to go through that level of commitment, then it may not indeed be the right choice.
Great, thank you, Steve. There's a few process questions left over that maybe you can communicate directly about those. So I think I will stop the presentation right here. On the screen, if you have additional questions, here are Joe's, Stephen's, and Kent's email addresses. You feel free to email them with your questions. And I just want to go ahead and thank all of my presenters, Joe Marlow, Stephen Aldrich, and Kent Redford, for joining us and contributing to the webinar today. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
And, sure. And as for our audience, thank you for your interest and questions. Remember to let us know if you are interested in developing a webinar for the Practitioners Network for Large Landscape Conservation. And thank you to the Sonoran Institute for working with us to offer this webinar. Well, this concludes our presentation for today. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.